My name is John Brook. I run the Center for Historical Research, and I want to thank you all for coming. And welcome Diane King to our first official spring. We've already had an unofficial rescheduled spring. And it occurred to me as I was Xeroxing, wait a minute, somebody's missing on the top of this page. But you were actually Diane is now associate professor.
Very close.
Very close. Very close.
The dean has said that he would like that.
That's good. Well, that's one step after another. And in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Kentucky. And she's the author of Kurdistan on the Global Stage, Kinship, Land, and Community in Iraq, put out by Rutgers last December. And her title is here. Our comment today is by Morgan New, who is an associate professor I now find in 3 departments. I had him pegged in comparative studies, but then I was corrected, said it was NELC, Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. The web says CS and NELC, and now I'm told in person it's comparative studies, Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and anthropology. So I think that's probably a record of and Morgan is the author of, I'm assuming among other things, Under Solomon's Throne, Uzbek Visions of Renewal in Osh, which is a region of Kurdistan. Part of the Central Asian Context series coming out of Pittsburgh in 2012. And there are copies. I'm just going to do this to do, absolutely shameless self-promotion here. Copies of the program for the spring and for next year floating around. But in 2 weeks, Cliff Ando will be here from the University of Chicago with a title, Ambitions of Government, Territoriality, and Infrastructural Power in Ancient Rome. So with that, I'm going to turn some lights down and have people look to dark. You need this. I'm always walking away with it.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's great to be here. It's been great to be here this year. I feel very privileged. It's my job to sit and write a book and teach a senior seminar, and it's all been great fun. And I don't want it to end. So what you're getting today, and what you see in the paper that I'm told everyone has read. We'll find out. I'll quiz you. You are seeing part of this book project, and I would also like to say you're seeing a very early version on it. So I'm really eager for your feedback later. And what I'm going to do right now is just kind of look through some PowerPoints and give you some basic concepts that I'm working with in the book. The main concept is Patriliny. Patriliny is an idea out of anthropological kinship studies, and my training is in cultural anthropology, and it's great fun to be blending history and anthro in this project. So here's a kinship chart, and anthropologists love these, or at least we used to. Kinship was much more fashionable 100 years ago than it is now, although a good number of us are trying to bring it back. So the idea is there's a founder, or as I call him in the paper, an apical ancestor. He's several generations back. The triangle is a symbol for the male, and circle is for the female. And this is a couple producing 2 sons and a daughter here. Note that all of their kids are in the orange patrilineage. This is the orange patrilineage. All right, and this has very tangible outcomes for everyday relations. I'm very interested in the everyday. So we have daughter orange here. She meets someone she doesn't know. She'll explain, well, I belong to, my father is Mr. Orange. And the sons will as well. Note that the daughter does not pass on orangeness. Okay? Her kids belong to their father's patrilineage, the white patrilineage. The sons do pass on membership, and you can see the daughter not passing it on here. By now, in 4 generations, we can see a group forming. This is really key to my project. The idea that a man who has sons and who has grandsons through those sons can create a group. And I'm applying this in my project to modern citizenship. And this is one of the main points of the book, and it goes against some very strong arguments in my field. So I'm really being challenged to set up my own argument to really make it credible, because it gets some orthodoxies. So this is, I won't get into all the details here, but what I want to show you here is just to show you corporate groups that have resulted from patrilineal. And you don't get to see all the lineal links here. And I actually made this chart based on an interview I did about a marriage being arranged, and who was visiting whom and trying to set up the marriage, and who ultimately proposed, and what sorts of identity categories resulted, and that would take the entire time that we have to unpack this whole chart here, looking at that level of detail. But this just shows you that these groups are distinct. So again, when these people meet each other in everyday life, they are associated with their group. I work in Kurdistan, as I'll tell you in a second. And that's not to be confused, by the way, with Kyrgyzstan. Kurdistan and Kyrgyzstan are near each other. And, well, same part of the world in general. Anyway, and there are some fun names that people have. I know some members of the grasshopper lineage. Grasshopper was the founder's nickname, and it stuck more than his actual name. So here are some definitions. Patriliny is descent reckoning through males alone. It's also called patrilineality, which I find to be a little more unwieldy, so I don't use that. And agnatic descent. These are synonyms. Patriarchy is overarching male dominance. That's my quick and dirty definition. Patriarchy and patrilineality, we could actually say a lot about their relationship. That's not our topic today. So I just wanted to clarify, patriarchy is something different. It's fuzzier. Okay, patrilineality is very specific in terms of the claims it makes on people's identity. In patrilineality, categories are received from fathers only. This is so key to the argument. And in the paper, we see modern citizenship being transmitted only through fathers. When you have a transmission of identity, or transmission of property, or transmission of anything at all, whether it's an idea or a tangible thing, going through only one parent, you get a purified claim. Okay? If something goes through 2 parents, there's a 50-50 thing going on. It has to be sorted out somehow. One parent simplifies. It also has outcomes that may stifle people. I'm not going to go into all of those right now, although we can talk about them in the discussion. That would be fun. So patrilineality has a lot of advantages in a lot of different situations. It also creates these very defined categories. It's found throughout the Middle East, a few parts of Europe, and elsewhere. And elsewhere really means in little areas all over the globe. It's found deep in the Amazon. It's found in European history. Jack Goody is kind of the authority on kinship systems in Europe for the last, I'm not sure how far back he goes, but at least the last 500 years he's analyzed European kinship systems. And he finds them falling either under patrilineal or bilateral kinship, which is the dominant form in mainstream American culture, where both parents are seen to be passing on identity, and therefore corporate groups don't form. They form for a generation. They're seen at holidays. People are gathering. Many of us just did that. We gathered in a corporate group, but that group will look different a generation from now, and it won't exist really a generation from now in the same way it would if it were unilineal, or formed based on only one parent passing on identity. That aspect would be equally true in a matrilineage. Matrilineal and patrilineal differ in some important ways, actually because patrilineal also contains in it male dominance. And there's some male dominance in matrilineal too. That again would be a longer story. So this paper is part of a larger project that grew out of a recent book. I do want to give a plug for my recent book because it's so recent that it's dated 2014. So it just came out a month ago. And while I was working on this, I realized I actually have a larger project on my hand, and I can't. My publisher, Rutgers, was very generous in many ways, but they said you cannot have more than 100,000 words, and I had many more than that. So they made me chop parts of it out, and that material will appear in this book. So I realized I have actually a case that I'm building that goes far beyond my actual field site, my little local field site in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And this book now draws on 10 ethnographic field stints. So I, as an ethnographer, I go and I hang out. That's what other disciplines say that we do, and I embrace that. Hang out with people, listen to them, and take notes. And I've been doing that in the Kurdistan region of Iraq since 1995. And I also taught at American University of Beirut for 6 years. And this year I'm doing archival work. So this is really a hybrid project of pulling together these three strands, and obviously scholarly sources as well. There's been some wonderful work on this that is in different places, and it's highly local and is not making as large an argument as I'm making. So I'm pulling from some of those. Some of the categories that are patrilineal in Kurdistan are patrilineage itself, and in English people will call this a family. Family doesn't cut it. Family is much too fuzzy. But there's no term in English that everyone knows. I like to go around Kurdistan, and when I'm speaking in English, I teach people the term patrilineal. Well, we have a word, because they say, there's no word in English really, and I go, yeah, there is. I'm trying to make it better known. Tribe, Ashuret. So you're part of a tribe. Lineages belong to tribes. Individuals don't belong to tribes. Most people in Kurdistan belong to a tribe and are very proud of that. It's not like in other places where people are trying to get away from a tribal claim. It's very much played up in Iraqi Kurdistan. I find that it's different in Turkey. A lot of people there may not want to emphasize the tribe. Sect, Sunni, Chaldean, Shi'i, Assyrian, Suryani. Religion, Muslim, Christian, Yazidi, and ethnicity/nation. Kurdish, Turkoman, Arab. And these can combine in different ways. It's actually not that predictable. You have to learn them one by one, okay? All Yazidis actually, Yazidism is a religion, but it's also an ethnic, it's also a sub-ethnic category within Kurdish. Yazidis are ethnically Kurdish, etc. So these are categories that carry a great deal of meaning in people's everyday lives. It is impossible now, this can change, but it is impossible to go around Kurdistan participating in civic life or any sort of social life and not divulge these categories for yourself. And I have seen some conversations. I remember a colleague at the university, I taught at the Hook University as well in Iraq in the 90s. And a colleague of mine claimed to be from the Barwadi tribe, and I listened to a conversation between him and another Barwadi, and the other guy said, I'm a Barwadi and I know all the lineages in the Barwadi tribe, and I have never heard of this lineage that you say you belong to. So I don't believe that you're a Barwadi. And the other guy's like, but I'm from such and such a village, and I have never heard of that village either. So, you know, people, and the Barwadi tribe is actually huge, and it probably has at least 500 villages. So I kind of felt sorry for my colleague. But, you know, this is in the university, in the hallway of the university, and I have not seen a realm of life where people can get away with just sort of being ethnically Kurdish without these other subcategories. What I'm arguing in this book is that we have a new patrilineal category, and that is citizenship in the modern state. Citizens are members of a political entity encompassing a fixed territory. Patrilineages are connected to fixed territory, etc., etc. I have many other comparisons that I make between the two, and we can talk more about that as well. From the start, Iraqi citizenship was only passed on patrilineally, and the Iraqi state itself saw itself as Arab, and that's a whole story in itself too, where you have these nationalist movements in the 20th century that are thoroughly patrilineal. They're based on the idea that there's a man and he has his offspring who comprise more of his category. And you had these fertility campaigns, etc., in the 22 Arab states especially, trying to make more people belonging to certain categories, the Arab category in particular. So the Iraqi state saw itself as Arab. Actually, I was going to take out that last sentence because this was, I used this slide in a presentation on the linkages I make between state-sponsored patrilineal and genocide, which, again, is another large topic. But the Iraqi government used very clearly patrilineal categories to sort people and to decide who it wanted to eliminate in its genocidal campaigns in the 1980s. So that's the real dark side of the state using these categories. So I just want to show you the outline of the book. You have these subcategories that are up here because you have them. So just showing you how this all fits together. Kinship studies and the state is really the overarching. You know, this project is coming from kinship studies, but it's going into the study of the state, which is itself innovative because there was. If you look at all of the early historical materialist work on the early state, and so much of it was speculative. There was this idea that there's an early matrilineage and that grew into a state, and then it became patrilineal as it morphed into a state, and etc. Very, very speculative work. That begins 100 years ago, or a little more than 100 years ago. And what you have within my field of anthropology is a very strong bracketing off of kinship, in which people asserted that kinship belonged to the study of non-states. Okay? You could not apply kinship to the state. It's just, you know, once you get to a state, especially a modern state, kinship drops off. It just sort of fades away, and new things matter. New categories come in, and I'm saying no. the new is the old. So that's why I have to start from there with the literature trail that goes back a century. This other stuff you've read, hopefully. Chapter 4, patrilineal memory. Now I use memory in other parts of the book that you didn't read because there's a claim being made, and that claim relies on memory. Someone says, I'm a descendant of so-and-so. That means they're claiming my father is so-and-so, and his father is so-and-so, and his father is so-and-so, and so on. And all over the Middle East, you have claims of descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Okay? That's a claim that relies on purported memory going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. All right, so memory is very important here, and indigenous, modern, I think, is an unnecessary distinction. And sectarianism, confessionalism. This is part of. You read part of this. I am extremely surprised that in the literature on sectarianism, there's no mention of the glaring fact that the main sectarian conflicts in the Middle East, and I could apply this elsewhere in the world, I'm limiting this book to the Middle East, in those conflicts, in every single case of which I'm aware, the groups are defined patrilineally. Okay, Sunni Shia conflict in Iraq, Lebanon, 17 different groups, all in various different relationships to each other, and some of them violent, etc. Thoroughly patrilineal. All right, so this is really quite stark and interesting. I'll end with in this part with some pictures. This is a village. Again, this is a section that you did not read. I really emphasize the relationship between land, territory, and patrilineal claims. I've done many interviews with people about their patrilineages, and I always want to know. I preferred Methodists to go back in time, and interviewees tend to like that too. So, okay, explain who your father is, and then keep going until we get to the apical ancestor. And there's always a story about this guy. And he, as I say in a co-authored article, 2010 article with Linda Stone, we say that this guy did something memorable, and we really tore our hair out over what we could assert about him that would apply in all the different cases. Because as I looked at my data, I found that there is always a story. Okay, you never have this generic guy that, you know, someone claims descent from and they don't know anything about him. No, there is a man who has a story, and what we came up with is he did something memorable. What it could be varies completely. It could even be notorious, or it could be a negative thing. He could be a murderer, okay, and everyone knew that, and then his descendants are marked by that. What we found also is that, or what I found in my work in Kurdistan, is that it always involves place, and oftentimes he's arriving to a place, okay? We don't know where he was before, maybe. And oftentimes there's no record of where he came from. It's just the fact that he arrived and began to live in this village and stayed there. Now, patron-client relationships are very important in these stories. You can't just move around, and this takes you back to the Ottoman Empire and Persian and actually Russian Empire. You go just north of where I work. So there were these nested levels of power, and you couldn't just move around and, you know, decide to buy a house in the village. You've got the part about what a village is. A village is actually an area of land. It's not a house. It's not a cluster of houses. So you can't just start living somewhere without permission from a patron higher up. So land is very important, and this is a typical Kurdish village. That's one of the houses in that same village. And this is what I found when I first went to Kurdistan. And this is almost just for fun. I just want to show you some contrasts here. This is at the end of my street. So I lived about a block from this rubble. This is from the 80s attacks on the Kurds by the Iraqi government. And this is a bomb casing in one of the villages that I work in. And the village, when I first went there in the late 90s, was littered with these things. They're still there. I was last in this village in 2010. And people are using these as, like, vases for dry flowers and things. So it's a swords into plowshares kind of thing. And this is now the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I'm trying to show you a complete contrast here. It is bustling. It is one of the world's fastest growing economies. It is newly wealthy from oil. Not every individual is wealthy. That's there's a big question mark over who will benefit here. But what I'm seeing on my trips is a massive process of change into a modern state. Never mind that it's not fully sovereign. It's not fully sovereign, but it has just moved on from this question of what its relationship to Iraq is in many ways, and it is sort of just getting on with building a statelet that's technically within Iraq. And so these questions of the citizen, who belongs to Kurdistan, will be very, very important as it becomes more wealthy. As being a citizen means getting the benefits that, for example, the Saudi citizens get now. You can actually get money from the state and free university education, etc. If you are a citizen, and if you are not a citizen, you're nowhere. You don't get these things. So as Iraqi Kurdistan modernizes, it's going to be drawing on, I predict, patrilineal categories to sort out who's who. This is also, I just wanted to show you, in Lebanon, when I was there, I experienced the assassination of the former prime minister, and I took this picture at the site about 3 or 4 hours later, and that's his SUV there that's toasted in the middle. Lebanon is the site, and just the other day, one of my students lost his father in another car bombing. In Lebanon, we are seeing Lebanon is one of the sites of what is becoming a sectarian war all across the region. I think patrilineal needs to be better known. If people know that there are different ways to sort out identity, people in the region start talking about this, I think that could be a good thing. They're the ones who have to decide what sort of futures they want. In 2011, we saw people really starting to express their displeasure with what they see. I would like patrilineal to be part of the conversation. I would like people to discuss amongst themselves whether they might want to set up different ways of understanding who's who. Again, that's not for me, that's for them to figure out. So that's the picture I'll leave you with. That's also from the Hariri assassination. And that is it's kind of depressing, isn't it? I'm sorry. That's the logical end of the worst excesses of patrilineal. And then there are many benefits. You know who's who, and you know where you belong, and you know who your people are. So when I discuss possibilities for the future with people in the region, this is what they know. They know they're going to have to sort out what is most dear to them. Let me put it that way. So I will end there. Look forward to Martin's.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here and to speak to you here. And Diane made her first point concerning what anthropology has been concerned with in the past. I think it's very appropriate for me to begin with, because I'm very much for the de-ghettoization of anthropology. The kinds of kinship studies of a century ago that Diane was showing diagrams about, that was, for a lot of anthropologists, precisely the kinds of things that make our discipline very esoteric and very narrow in its scope, that seems to not really speak to broader questions about historical questions and other global concerns. And I'm very much for Diane's general move in trying to de-ghettoize anthropology. She can use those words. But the general idea is that taking something that's very much a very essential part of what the founding concerns of anthropology, that anthropology sees itself as moving beyond, bringing it back in a very new way, speaking to vital questions of the world. So I think that in the broadest terms, that's something I think it's very exciting about. Specifically for this seminar about state formations, I wanted to step through some of what I see are the implications of Diane's project to the concerns of this seminar, concerning understanding the modern state most broadly. And so what I like to do is just reiterate in my own words what I believe her central argument is, and reorganize that in a way that I feel would be maybe helpful for us to think with. In other words, what I'm going to do is talk about certain implications of what she's arguing about concerning the nature of modern states. So, so let me begin. So her central argument is Patriliny is integral to the conceptions of citizenship and group membership in the Middle East, and that it is strongly influenced. It strongly influences ideas and practices pertaining to the state and the nation there. And she very much emphasizes that this is despite a general denial about this. So this is where she tries to make her contribution, saying that even though Patriliny is everywhere in a certain sense, that very, very few scholars have actively acknowledged it or done anything with it, and this is precisely what she's trying to change. Particularly she says that Middle Eastern leaders have often drawn on, rather than turned away from, patrilineal concepts in their promotion of the modern. So that this is something very integral to the development of the modern nation state in the Middle East that the leaders themselves seems to be very much aware of, but analysts, scholars seem not to be. And this, finally, she says, produces an ironic citizen regime, and that's an idea that I want to come back to at the end of my comments. And so Diane is arguing in part from her field work in Iraqi Kurdistan, where most of the social categories, the dominant ones, are profoundly patrilineal. Okay, so for me, the big questions that are raised by Diane's projects are these. What kinds of states does a patrilineal paradigm produce? Or, phrased differently, how do we discern the presence of patriliny in modern Middle Eastern states? So what are the sites? What are we looking at for the presence, the effects of patriliny? What difference is it making? So that's the first sort of big questions. Second, what kinds of social relations are produced by patriliny? This is looking maybe at a more ground level, or at least how do social relations articulate with patriliny? If we maybe want to move away from this sort of causality, a causal argument that, if we don't want to buy into a strong argument that patriliny produces necessarily certain kinds of social relations or state formations, we can at least think about articulation and co-production. And how this is manifested in everyday life is indeed the research sites that Diane works at. So actually, in that first count concerning the everyday sites, it's almost like a side comment here. Diane actually brings an interesting example of that. She refers to as tea-serving episode. Some of you might remember that. You served tea to a group of women, and you were literally put in a position where you had a tray of tea and had to decide who to serve first and second and fourth, and because that very much matters. And you were trying to figure out what are the hierarchies and how do you determine hierarchies, and that indeed is a very, those are the kinds of exciting sites that anthropologists love to do. But I think what you might want to spell out more is you drop the very intriguing notion that patriliny is somewhere there in that picture, and you said probably to do with the male the males of each of these. They're the ones who determine the hierarchy here. But you didn't spell that out. I'd very much like to hear that for a case like that or any other. So in other words, the strength of the book will rest on spelling out examples like this. When you serve tea, where is Patriliny? And so forth. So that's the first sort of side comment there. Because I think so far in the paper, I would say, and I think Diane admits this to me privately, the connection isn't quite there yet. The knockdown argument of at least the co-production of Patriliny and these social forms, state forms, we need to spell out more carefully. So, okay, what I'm going to do now is, after having raised these big questions, so what? Where is Patriliny? How is it producing or co-producing these forms? I'd like to articulate a few of what I think Diane's argument is of the consequences of Patriliny in state. So, these are my categories. So I guess one meta question is, do these categories make sense? Are they helpful for you, and so forth? Okay, so impact one I'll call. The states, so Patriliny, how it articulates with states, it articulates in the state's mechanism for governance, she says. So specifically, she argues that Patriliny mediates at least for some of the population the mechanisms of governance for them. So, the example is that she talks about the Ara, which is a paramount leader, locally powerful figure, through whom you get things done. Whether it's to broker the relationship of individuals with the state, you go through your Ara, and or it's concerning disputes between people that you go mediation of disputes through this guy, and as a bridge to other groups who are in competition for resources, and this would include feuds, but not necessarily. And you draw an analogy to Heglin's new ethnography set in revolutionary Iran, that the winner of a power struggle, the power figure, the broker who wins a certain power struggle, then thereby secures resources for the entire group. So there are, of course, real world consequences to what these people do. So again, the first argument she says is that because so many of these disputes and claims of resources are happening through these figures who are very much part of the patrilineal structure, therefore the state's connection with the populace is mediated through Patriliny. Okay, so that's the first part. She also argues for the meanings of citizenship as being seen through the patrilineal prism. In the 20th century, patriliny became the basis of citizenship in the modern state, so that only fathers can pass citizenship to the great majority, in the great majority of Middle Eastern states, with a big exception of Turkey, of course, and that's relatively recent, 2001, I believe. Diane does say, well, this is true for a lot of parts of the world. In fact, you might say most parts of the world. But her argument is that the patrilineal passing of citizenship has persisted longer in the Middle East than other parts of the world. And I think that's something that's worth discussion, especially in a comparative context. To think, I think many of us might say, wait a minute, that this is something that the Middle East by no means has a monopoly on. Was it just yesterday in NPR, there was a discussion about the inheritance of titles, of peerage titles in Britain today, and the Parliament is considering changing that to solve what's called the Downton Abbey syndrome. So these are the discussions are even in Britain currently. So maybe a very good question a reader would ask is, Willie, what is special about the Middle East? Is there something very unique here that we need to pay attention to? Yes, and of course, religious affiliation, sectarian, all those other categories of identity that Diane just showed us are patrilineal in reckoning. And this is ultimately from the Millet system under the Ottoman Empire, of course. This is a lot of history I'm sure you'll talk about in your book there. So this is, in other words, an argument about the state's constituency, that patrilineal is there in the way citizens are reckoned. Okay, that's point 2. Point 3, acts of self-identification. I assiduously avoid the word identity. I never use it in writing, and I think maybe share this part. I always cite Fred Cooper's article about that. He has a very good critique about the overloaded nature of that word. So I try to be specific. So acts, these are not reified entities or anything. Acts of self-identification are impacted by patrilineal, is Dan's next point. So this is I think a very point that's very worth making that she makes. There are no hybridities in this way of looking at the social world. You cannot say I'm half Arab, half Kurdish, the way that a lot of us might want to do that. And of course, in social theory, we're all into hybridities, right? But there, no, it's very clear that you have one form of identification that comes from your dad, and so mixes are not even in the conceptual universe of social reckoning. One's reputation and standing is a function of one's lineage founders. So this has implications in public sphere interactions. So you said you're never a stranger. You meet somebody, you immediately work out the calculation. Okay, you're some. So yeah, okay, now I know how to locate you, and we're good now. So that's very much patrilineal is certainly there, and I think what the implications of this kind of impact is that a lot of us, especially in history, think about the conjuncture, the very curious conjuncture between state and sentiment. We're always thinking about how states produce certain kinds of postures, of subject positions in its either imperial subjects or citizens and so forth. And so this is certainly something to think about in regard to that literature about patrilineal as one mode of social of categorizing people that determines their very sentiments about themselves, their very feelings about themselves. Impact 4, I have 2 more left. Impact 4, the spatiality of the state, and this is something that she alluded to the very last slides of the Kurdish village. And it's something that she admittedly does not expand about here, but she will in the book. But the question is what is the relationship between tribalisms and territoriality? So she said tribes are territory-based where she works, except for possibly former nomads. To such an extent that when one lives outside of one's tribal territory, Diane makes a very strong claim that you are considered a IDP, an internally displaced person. Now, that's something I think you really need to justify a bit. Is this something that is this your analysis, or is this something that some actual interview subjects have said?
Yeah, I actually cover that in my book that just came out, and this is recognized by the UN, and I have stories in there of people that explain their displacement to me, and yeah, the UN is there giving out IDP cards, and they get certain benefits, etc.
So tremendous implications for transnational legal regimes and so forth. So again, an articulation of, again, patrilineal reckoning of territory and these legal regimes. So very, very interesting question right there. My mistake was printing this in too small a font. I cannot read my own notes. Yes, I'm just thinking contrastively that there are other tribalisms, tribal reckonings in other parts of the world have different understandings of the relationship between territoriality and tribalism. Where I work in Central Asia, it's a very different notion, and we can talk about that in more detail some other time. differences. Last impact, legitimation of state leaders. This is very brief, that state leaders legitimate themselves in terms of their agnatic descent, their reckoning through their ancestors. So it's everywhere. So my final comments here are considering this notion of irony that Diane wants to bring out. That her claim is that given all the way that Patriliny is ramified in the way states are governed, the way citizens are constituted, the way people look at themselves, and so on and so forth, then what you're ending up is a very ironic regime of citizenship. Ironic because, one, documentation and law are associated with modernity, the coming of the bureaucratic state. But patrilineal memory has a much longer history. So that's sort of ironic, that opposition. It's ironic because one's identifications are not chosen, that they are imputed, that it denies individual choice, and it denies hybridities, which is a very unmodern way of reckoning people. And ironic because lineage-based societies fragment your citizenry in a way that a generic, sort of homogeneous space of citizenry would tend to stand against. So these are the ironies she wants to bring out. And so my final comment is, perhaps we want to question this opposition, or maybe I'm making this opposition out to be too stark. It's more nuanced in what you're writing. And so why must the whole package of modernity be assumed to be asserted in the modern state? And this, I think, will go to some of the broader concerns of the seminar, concerned with the nature of the modern state. So rather, I mean, there are many ways of critiquing this this notion of sort of essentially I think what Diane's doing is sort of taking modernity as a package and seeing how that package differs from traditional package. And so if you have one and not the other, then you've got an ironic mix. But rather, if that in fact is what she's saying, again, I might be unfair here, but rather there are other ways of looking at this, and many of you are familiar with this, but one way I like to think about it, alternative ways of thinking, is what anthropologist James Ferguson has written about, when he's written about conceptions of modernization in Zambia, that he talks about so-called full house of alternatives in modernizations. So that he's actually taking this from the biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who uses this term full house in his evolutionary theory. In other words, rather than moving from some old evolutionisms of the 19th century that looked at paradigmatic stages that succeed one another, Stephen Jay Gould's arguing that even in biology, that evolution theory is more like a whole fan of alternatives, that what he calls a whole full house of alternatives, that biological variation is full of a multitude of complexities and variations that you cannot assign paradigmatic stages to them. So Jim Ferguson, the anthropologist, appropriates that for social theory and says, likewise, should we not think about modernities in that way? That it is an assemblage of different components, that there is no paradigmatic package of modernity, but in different places and times, that they come in different packages. So I'm sure a lot of you could express this in better ways than I just did with different theorists. But so what we have here is a particular formation with particular historical path through colonialism, appropriating global modules in particular ways. So what I suggest is to reframe, if this makes sense, parts of this ironic argument in the book, that rather than seeing an ironic opposition of the modern and the pre-modern paradigms of societal and state organization, rather show that modern states have particular formations of bricolage that are none of which are paradigmatically modern in a pure sense. But you're right that no scholars have looked at this. So I think this has, what you're doing is indeed very new and very exciting. And let me just finally, finally just put a quick note here about property. This is something that we need to talk about here, that maybe you're talking about elsewhere, which is property regimes and rules of inheritance. That space may not be coextensive with patrilineal reckonings of descent. And so I think part of the story you want to tell is also about how property regimes are certainly implicated with patrilineal, but there are other considerations that complexify that field as well. That's also part of the story of looking at, again, where is patrilineal in the modern state. So I think that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for your attention.
Stay seated, if that's okay. Thank you, Morgan. That was fantastic. I already took copious notes, and I will refer back to the video. Wow, I would love to tell you everything that I've been thinking, but I think I'm supposed to see if there are any questions. So I can respond to that if we run out of energy.
Yes, I would at some point like to have we could have a long talk about various things, but one of the things that interests me right now is first of all, before I forget, I noticed you didn't mention Elizabeth Thompson in the chapter that we read, and her book about colonial citizenship and the use of both ethnic discrimination and gender discrimination to sustain French rule and mandatory Syria is, of course, very relevant to what
her work is very important to me.
Yeah.
And if I didn't cite it, I actually meant to cite Colonial Citizens, and we're reading it in the course I'm doing that's connected to this. So.
Okay, well, aside from that, if I'm only going to mention one other thing, I'm very grateful to see somebody come up with something to provide some deeper lying explanation about why sectarianism seems to loom so large in the Middle East today. It seems to me that there's something, I mean, I'm not saying it's not a underlying conflict, but the way scholars understand it, there's something about that doesn't satisfy somehow. Everybody blames it on the Millet system of the Ottoman Empire. The Millet system of the Ottoman Empire was simply the minimum principles of Islamic law, and the only thing that was different under the Ottoman Empire was that in the 19th century this started getting politicized. And it's not that the Ottomans did this, it's just that it happened, it was happening to them too. Mm-hmm. And then you get places like post-colonial regimes in Lebanon where people, one of the themes in the Lebanese that started out particularly in the sort of nationalist school is to seem to want to blame this on the Ottomans, as if that leaves, is an answer to why the Lebanese are completely lacking an agency to do anything about this.
For a very long time.
Once you blame it on the Ottomans, then well.
Turks and
and if the idea is something, if there's something so powerful about it, and there's something so irredeemable about it, or unsolvable about it, maybe it actually will help to change the debate, to shift the emphasis to something deeper underlying it. And of course, the imprint of this on politics, what's the word used for executive power in Kurdistan or in Iraq today?
I don't know.
Like the power of the president. You know what the word term used in Turkey is? It's a loan word from Arabic.
Might be the same one in Kurdistan.
Iqtidar.
Oh.
And you know what else that means? Sexual potency.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow, my goodness. Wow. I like that. Thank
You
you.
want some patriarchy?
That
Have I got
That
patriarchy for
must
you?
find its way into my book.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
30?
That's wonderful.
I thought I like thinking of kinship as a category, and I think it adds a lot to the analysis. In my own work, I try to do some of the same thing on 19th century East Africa, Indian Ocean world. But I was left hungry in this paper for, okay, if patriliny is everywhere, where does it break down? And I'm really curious, and you know, I've been thinking a lot about mobility, and so I'm curious about questions of mobility and the state. And I'm thinking of work like In-Seng Ho and his work on Yemen and this kind of extreme mobility in that sense, but also in Lebanon thinking about the important role of West Africa and the presence of Lebanese settlers in West Africa and the kind of translocality that gets set up by these kind of things. So these kind of things really challenge a territorial state and territorial senses of belonging, and I think would help us rethink or stretch patriliny and how far it might go or where it snaps. And the other thing then is to go in a time depth. That's sort of a geographical, a horizontal stretching, and then the time depth, you know, in terms of incorporation. What about in many Middle Eastern societies? What about the incorporation of former slaves? How do they become citizens in new nations? And I know that this has been a question that around the Gulf they've struggled with, and trying to give full citizenship rights in a kind of modern state kind of way, but at the same time having to deal with status, ongoing status concerns. And so, do you erase? You know, do you give people new nisbas? Do you give people new tribal names, or do you just have everyone erase their own? I know in Oman they tried for some time to not have people use their kind of sub-tribal names, but only to use broader kind of names. So, you know, how this question of incorporation of slaves in the past, but also incorporation of new citizens. I know that in the UAE, one of their ways of giving citizenship to people who've been there for a long time, they don't give them Emirati citizenship. They have a deal to give them Comorian citizenship. And so the Comoros, an island in the Indian Ocean, has sort of sold its passports to long-term Emiratis, and the Emiratis have then made a special special visa arrangements for Comorian citizens. And so, but these kind of questions of how states incorporate new citizens, or I think would challenge, or at least make us see better the outlines of patriliny that you're trying to describe. So I'm very interested in what the limits of this model are.
I know I might sound like a used car salesperson, but if you buy my book, you'll
$26.
see. It's on sale. No, I do deal with a lot of that as it pertains to Kurdistan in my book. I would argue that territoriality and mobility are actually excellent frames for looking at patriliny. And what we see in the record worldwide is that, especially if you're going to take the Gulf states, and I'm not an expert on the Gulf states, but from what I have read, I see that they are very reluctant to absorb new citizens, and this sounds like an example to me of the state bending over backwards to avoid absorbing any new citizens, because of the idea that, I'm arguing that there's a patrilineal idea here, and if you're not in one of those patrilines, we just can't figure out how to get you into the state. With the Lebanese in West Africa are a great example of that. I think that just shows patrilineal working. I don't think it challenges patrilineal at all. The people who have migrated are almost all male. They go down there, they work for a while, they come back and they get brides. And they may get married locally. They are creating Lebanese people no matter where they are. Because Lebanese-ness, and this is not in the part you read, but this will be in the book. Lebanese-ness is transmitted by men, not by presence on Lebanese territory, for 3 generations. Yes, I think that when we see these trends going out of migration and maybe different understandings of territory too that we're seeing in the modern state, at first glance, we could think that these are eroding patrilineal. I do see, I see one trend, let me say that I see one trend that is eroding patrilineal at the state level, and that is women being able to pass on citizenship. And that is now the case in Morocco. It's being debated in several different places. Turkey is 2001, as I wrote, and apparently Iran too, as I learned in class earlier today. I hadn't checked that one out. Yeah.
Now, women can pass on citizenship now as well,
If that is the case, then that's quite radical, and I was very. I'll be checking out Iran. Let me put it that way. But women being able to pass on citizenship is significant. Property regimes too. Just to come back to some of Morgan's comments, I've looked at Iraq quite specifically, and women can receive property. So we have to look at what does the law say. And by the way, Iraqi law is an utter mess right now because there was the transitional reduction, and I think she's got it figured out. So as people start to consider new ideas, the momentum for change is coming from them, but it presents these terrible choices. And I was talking with a guy who immigrated here to Columbus recently from Iraq about these things. And I said, and I was telling him about my book, and he said, I want to move in a direction that is going away from the effects of patrilineal. And I said, so are you willing to give up your patrilineal membership and your tribe and all that? And he goes, oh. I go, it's painful, isn't it? It's very painful. Yeah. So then I asked him, I said, so where does that leave you? He said, I don't know. And I feel like that's where a lot of people are who are looking at their options. So yes, Carter.
If I don't want to talk too much, but you've got so much evidence from this particular locality, and there's some obviously very powerful structures and some very deep continuities and so forth. But at the same time, in the spirit of not overgeneralizing, I hope you'll also find ways to allow for a certain range of variation. What you just said brings up one example of this, which I've already seen or heard about through the research of some other people on the Alevi communities of Turkey. They started out as very isolated village communities. Then they moved off to the cities, and then eventually off to Europe and places like that. And the old, the social structures that were so relevant to them were the lineages of the religious leaders. And those structures and the authority of the religious leaders as opposed to the lay leaders became impossible to maintain in Ankara and Istanbul, let alone Berlin. And so as your people start to move out, for example, they're going to find these structures subjected to new change. Another historic example of this range of variation, when you were talking about this, it reminded me of something that Peter Golan pointed out in his introduction to the history of the Turkic peoples, because these are peoples that initially started out with completely tribal structures. But then at the time of the Mongol invasions, most notably, a lot of that was smashed, either on purpose or either by being absorbed into the Mongols or being defeated by the Mongols, smashed and dispersed. And in the literature on ethnogenesis, this is apparently the point in which you begin to get the rudiments of a detribalized Tatar population, spilling out onto the steppes of Eurasia, and a detribalized Turkish population, spilling out into Anatolia. And so at the very same time that we have executive power understood with this term iqtidar, in the very same country, and obviously patrilineal structures are very important, but tribalism is just, for most people in the country, it's just a residual memory, and it's appears in surnames and things like that. Your actual research data reflects an environment where these conditions are still
Sure.
maybe more strongly maintained than they are in some other
Absolutely.
places. I guess that's the,
Yeah.
I'm really getting to.
Another section of the book that you didn't see is this part of the introduction. Is why Kurdistan? Why use Kurdistan as a case? And I argue in that well, it's important to me, obviously, generally as an anthropologist who works there. But what's most important in this aspect of the argument is the religious angle. You have Jewish, Christian, and Muslim patrilineal structures that are very, very well defined in Kurdistan in ways that they aren't in other places. And for example, the priests of the Nestorians, now called the Assyrians, they practiced patrilineal descent, but they were celibate, and so it was the son of the priest's brother who inherited the role. This is very innovative. This is taking strands of succession, going back hundreds of years and making something that no one has heard of. And Yazidis as well. Yazidis have a closed lineal system in which you can't convert to or from Yazidism. Okay, it's completely closed. It's completely endogamous, so there are no marriages out to outsiders by either sex. So that's patrilineal that doesn't even trust wives coming in. That is really, and there's a caste system. These cities have a caste system that's patrilineal. Who knew there was a caste system in Iraq? Okay, so we have these wonderful ethnographic examples in this little place, and there's been a lot that's happened there that's specific, but I think it also allows us to see, creative applications of patrilineal side by side. So, yes, Jean?
Could you say a little bit about the way in which these lineages are or are not attached to the reproduction of wealth? I mean, you talked to our group a few hours ago about how these lineages have definite statuses. Is status something that is simply out there and kind of free-floating, and once you have it, you always have it? Or is it attached to reproduction of material wealth? And I think this question is coming from an environment like China, where on the one hand there is very, very strong, there's actually ancestor worship, and it's typically, and it comes down through the male line, there's no question about that. And yet there is extraordinary familial mobility from peasant back to peasant in 5 generations. So I'm wondering, in the Kurdistan environment, how this actually works in terms of the reproduction of wealth and resources.
Yeah, great question, and I did deal with that in my book. I profile an Ava family that was very wealthy in the 50s. That was kind of the apex, and then they've been kind of going down, yeah. And you don't want to be them because they have all the clout still, and they don't have any money. So they have people visiting them and asking them for help, and I stayed with them during a lot of my. I still stay with them when I travel there during part of the time I'm there, and I see the pressure that they're under because of their reputation. Now, I would say that in another generation or two, if they haven't figured out how to find some wealth again, their patrilineage is not going to be well known, probably 2 generations. Now, some individual members have become wealthy very recently, and so if a patrilineage is recognized later, It's not founded at a particular, it's not recognized as having been founded in the present, okay? It's only recognized later. So what I'd like to know, and I'll never be able to answer this question because you can't answer it until 100 years from now, but I see some of the men in this lineage achieving highly in terms of material achievement. And I wonder if 100 years from now they will be the ones whose names are mentioned rather than their illustrious ancestor from the 19th century. Right now, the 19th century guy, I found him in a missionary account, which was a lot of fun, and it corroborated, it matched up with what the people had told me in oral history. So he was in this area and he was playing this role as a leader and etc. So I don't know if he's going to be mentioned 100 years from now. Maybe we're at about generation number 5 right now. And maybe these guys. People talk about new money. The Avas talk about non-Ava, newly wealthy people with scorn. They look down on them. But I think those are lineage founders in the making.
So in fact, these lineages and their reputations don't go back to the ancient mists of history. They're really that you can trace them back, 4, 5, 6 generations to particular figures. Okay.
Yes, as I argue in my book, they are thoroughly modern. Really, I mean, it depends on your definition of modernity, but yeah, they don't go back into the midst of time. You can find a missionary writing about their founder.
But there must have been, well, I won't go into that. There's this kind of lurking question. I'm not probably more than this time, but I guess we'll stick to the last 100 years or so. And on the one hand, I really have 2 questions. One has been lurking in the back of my mind. The commentary in the paper about the role of the French and the British in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, and essentially recognizing and intensifying patrilineal. I mean, the implication that they saw this as a convenient means of organizing the population, and they solidified it.
The French and British were having a race to do that.
Yeah, right. And I'm thinking of a paper given by Aisha Jalal at Tufts many years ago about how Sharia law was something really fluid, and the British came into India and just said, "Well, Sharia law, there we go," and it became something much more exaggerated than it had been before. So I keep wondering about what was the differential role of, the modern bureaucratic states in formation. I wonder about, hypothetical outcomes of, if it all remained out of it, what would have happened? What would have happened? What was the little incremental push of the colonial experience? The other question is more specific. I would think that patrilineal might be extremely useful when you're a society under violent stress and need to trust people. And Kurdistan, patrilineal is so important in Kurdistan. Well, Kurdistan has been under violent stress for at least 25 years, if not much longer. So is this a function of mountain peoples who are constantly bearing arms and trusting their brothers' sons? And
I have made that argument. Yeah, and actually that argument is very common in the people that are looking at the pre-state patrilineal groups. There's one. Well, there's a connection to conflict that's made by Jane Schneider. So she argues that patrilineal was shored up by conflict, basically what you just said, around in the circum-Mediterranean. So she sees this as happening around the Mediterranean, all the way around the Mediterranean. So Spain included, etc. And then there's also a pretty well-known book called, the title of which is Cattle Cause Patriliny.
Cattle.
Yeah, so it's cattle. So herding seems to go nicely with patrilineal. Herding in arid areas where you don't have fenced herds.
Right.
Okay, so if you and I used to fly between Europe and Beirut a lot, and I would stare out the window of the plane and wait until we got to the fences. Okay, so we're in the herding without fences. Oh, now I see the fences. And you get to Northern Europe and there's just fences everywhere. And you put your animals in there and, you know, you need to make sure that no one steals them. But there isn't the same sense of vigilance. You know, for Schneider, there's this really strong vigilance thing going on. And inheritance. You've got to know you're on the move. There isn't a lot of time to a man dies, okay? He has 40 head of sheep. You're packing, you're going to bury him, sorry?
He has his brand on them too, doesn't he?
Yes, they're branded. Yeah, they're in the larger herd of several hundred. And you're on the move, you're going up to your pastures, and you bury the guy, and you got to know whose sheep these are, like, immediately. We cannot have a tribal council that delays us for 3 days while we all decide who gets these sheep. No. You know, you have a very simple, and this is one of the advantages of Patriliny. I'm not going to do this in my own book because it's very well covered in the anthropological literature. What are the advantages of it? There are many in a pre-modern situation.
Well, there's another dimension of this physical space, which is courtyarded, structured walled compounds.
Mhm.
And I mean, I keep wondering about. I've been wondering for years about when I see walled compounds in New Mexico, and I think of walled compounds throughout the Mediterranean, walled compounds throughout the Middle East, walled compounds.
They might well have been patrilineal in New
And
Mexico.
in fact, I hate to,
Yeah.
I mean,
That's a
that
gender.
gets super meta, but walled compounds in semi-arid environments emerge in the late Neolithic.
Oh yeah, this is
6,000 BC. You start to see something that looks like these must be patrilineal households.
that's the thing. That's the thing. Patriliny is utterly ancient, and that's why I made that bold statement about, you know, people want to say this is Islamic law. Well, Islam is very new on the scene here when we're talking about Patriliny. So, yes.
Thank you. I got the pattern that you show us in the beginning of the speech about the role of the fathers and men in the family. Everything goes back to them. I'm wondering if you found any exception for that, because when I was growing in a village in central Iran in the 1970s, I remember that there were some families that we called them, or people called them, regard to their mothers, not to their fathers, because of different reasons. For example, the mother came from a distinguished family, or powerful lineage, or maybe they lost their father very early, and then people called them. I remember we had a neighbor that we said Hossein Fatime, not Fatime is a name for mother. And I'm wondering if you find something like this. My second question is about the Iranian Kurds in Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan. There are too many relationships between Kurds in different countries, Turkey, Iran, Syria, Iraq. But because of recent developments in Iran and also in Iraq, in different ways, after Saddam Hussein, many Kurds from Iran moved to Iraq, come back every day. Probably hundreds of Iranians move to Iraq and come back for trade, for everything.
There's a lot of traffic, yes.
And we have also some families that part of them are in Iraq, it means they are citizens of Iraq, and part of them are in Iran. They are citizens of Iran. And I'm curious to know how they define themselves, or the Kurdistani government define these Iranians in these kind of families. And because, also Kurds ethnically are more closer to Iranians than other countries that they are inside them. So I'm wondering, how could they define themselves?
Yeah, to address your second question first. So I work mainly in the part of Iraqi Kurdistan that's adjacent to Turkey rather than Iran. I've spent a lot more time there. So I prefer to give an example of ethnic Kurds from Turkey. They have to, so when I go there, any U.S. citizen can go there without a visa or you get a visa on arrival that lasts for, I think, 2 weeks. And after that, you have to apply for residency. So they're regarded as Turkish citizens in that encounter with the Iraqi Kurdistani statelet. But they're speaking Kurdish. People can tell from their speech that they're from Turkey because some of the vocabulary is different and the accent is different. They're regarded as Kurds. People might ask them, and where I work, there is a tribe, the Doski tribe, is split in two by the Iraq-Turkey border. And Doskis go back and forth all the time. I mean, socially, they are doing their best to pretend like there's no border. Now, you can't pretend like that border's not there. It's there, and if you get caught crossing it, there's smuggling. I can give you the smuggling rates if you want to know it. Interview people about what it costs. A donkey with smuggled cigarettes on it. It's pretty cheap. I think it's $20 to cross the area where the border is. The villagers will ask you to pay that. So yeah, we have to talk about what the situation is, but they don't get citizenship if that's what you're asking. No. Your other question about women. Now, in the paper I said Avas are almost always male, but they're not always male. There are several well-known female Avas from the last century in Iraqi Kurdistan. The difference is a woman cannot pass on lineal identity. She definitely can't in the eyes of the state. Okay. You can have some oral tradition about association with her that would last for maybe 3, 4, 5 generations, but she definitely can't start a matrilineage. That would be radical. I am not aware of a case in which a woman has started a patrilineage either. These situations, I'd have to know if the woman in question was a sister or was she a wife, and if a wife, was she from the same lineage as her husband? That would matter. But yes, women, and people like to point to these examples and say, see, it's a flexible system. It is, but what we can say is that she can't actually start something that is sustainable. She can have her moment during her lifetime, but she can't create categories that endure for multiple lifetimes. Yes, and I think we're supposed to stop soon. But Jane.
My question more or less follows up on John's about space. The village photographs you showed, those did not look like walled compounds, to say the least. And
in the city, they're walled.
okay,
Yeah.
well, in a village, how does patrilinealism, affect the spatial arrangement of the house of the village? Does the Aga's family? Well, I don't know that whole structure. Maybe the Aga doesn't live in the village, but
He has a house there.
and is his house like on top of the hill?
His house is usually bigger. Yeah, you can usually tell.
But and so that's really my question. Spatial relationships in the village, and even within a house. It's,
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so it's a patrilocal residence pattern. So let's say there's a nuclear family living in a house. These village houses are very small. So there's a couple and they're raising their kids. And then the oldest is a son. And it's time for him to marry. what they'll do is build another. This is all changing. The moment these economic things are out of my mouth, they're no longer true. But what I have seen, what I saw in the 90s, let me say, is they'll build another room onto the village house. The new couple, the bride will be brought there, and they will stay there for maybe a couple of years. He will work hard to get enough money to build a separate house, and then the separate house will be next door. It's not going to be far at all. And so, you know, kinship, if you were to map a village, I'm actually doing a long-term village study that has not seen the light of day, and I don't know when it will. But I started with 10 families, and then they all moved to town, every single one of them, and now a whole bunch of new people are in the village. I'm actually sort of losing control of who's who. But I do have a nice map of who owns each house, and it definitely tells a very, very patrilineal story. You know, this is the father, and he's got his 4 sons right here, and then this is another lineage, and etc. Now, because you have to control female mobility in order to ensure paternity, villages are a little bit dangerous in that way. And so a lot of the control is very personal. It's rather than, you know, in the city, you've got that compound, and that keeps people in as well as out. You know, if yeah, so there's a woman inside that compound, and everybody knows who's gone in, and she may well, if she's unmarried, she's living with her parents and her brothers probably. There may be some wives of her brothers. She's never home alone. There's never a woman of childbearing age who's never home alone. In the village, she's going to want to be visible. Okay, so women will prepare food, and they like to prepare food in groups. I love this idea of preparing food in groups, by the way. They're sitting there for hours, you know, doing the Kurdish food is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And it takes hours to prepare, and who wants to do that by themselves? Oh my goodness. So they'll take their food that they're, you know, the rice, they're picking rocks out of rice. That's one of the tedious things they do. And they'll take that next door, and then there's a woman from 3 doors down who's also over, and everyone, it's great fun. Gossip happens there. And in the village, it's a big party. You know, it's a lot of fun. The men are off doing their thing. Usually they might be working in the fields. Women also work in the fields. Everybody works in the fields, but it's a group thing. There is absolutely no concept of being alone, for women or men. I used to go around saying, I think I figured out the first rule of the society. Nobody's ever alone. Is that true? And my students in Iraq would go, yeah, that's it, yeah. So, you know, it's a surveillance environment, but it's also a warm environment. It's both.
They don't want to be. People
don't
who grow
want
up
to be
in this don't want to be alone.
That's
do
right.
They want to be.
Do not want to be alone. Yeah, I tell a little story in my book.
Aren't we the exception for wanting to be alone?
Yeah, we're crazy.
Yeah.
World historical
standards we got.
Yeah, when I leave Kurdistan and come, I always feel like the plane ride is not long enough. I want to go back to ships because I have to, you know, become a different person by the time I get here. When I'm there, I'm just
You've got to reclaim your individuality.
Yeah, really, it really, yeah. The contrast is incredible, and it's quite difficult at first. I'm getting better at it, but it's not easy. I think we're past our time now.
Okay, well, why don't we